Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. My name is Eric O'Shaughnessy. Today, I'll be discussing some research that we recently published in the journal iScience, Income-Targeted Marketing as a Supply-Side Barrier to Low-Income Solar Adoption. My colleagues Galen and Sydney are out here to help, and Sydney will be leading the Q&A later on, and Ryan Weiser may as well be out there somewhere. Before I begin, some typical housekeeping. Everyone in the webinar is on mute, but we do encourage you to enter questions as they come up into the Q&A rather than the text. So look for the Q&A, should be on the right or the bottom of your screen, and enter your questions in there as they come up, and we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. Also, this webinar is being recorded. As all webinars with research, I'm going to really pile through some results pretty quickly. So don't fret, don't be furiously jotting notes down. The webinar will be recorded and published on our website. And obviously, there's plenty more detail on the study in the paper itself. And with that, I want to start with a plug for some of our work here at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. This paper is part of a larger body of research on solar demographics, that is the demographic trends of rooftop solar adopters. There's a lot of additional resources at this link on this slide, including some interactive tool, some available data, and a bunch of other studies. So I encourage anyone who's interested in this topic to check out our further work here. So a high-level summary of what this paper is about and what we found. This paper is about a broader trend that is really well founded at this point, that low and moderate income, I'm going to use this term LMI throughout the presentation, LMI households are significantly less likely to adopt rooftop solar than higher income households. We sometimes refer to this as PV adoption inequity, simply meaning that low-income households are less likely to benefit from rooftop solar than high-income households. Previous research usually attributes this to demand-side barriers, but we are curious what supply-side factors could have a role. So we analyzed some quote data to explore the marketing patterns of installers, and really the two key findings that, as always, if nothing else you take away from this, the two key results are that households in low-income areas, and I'll define all of this later on, households in LMI areas tend to receive fewer quotes than households in more affluent areas. Another way to think about this is that installers are less likely to submit quotes to low-income households. A second key finding is that LMI households are less likely to close deals. By close, I'm meaning once receive a quote, they're less likely to actually finalize a deal. But there's this chicken and egg problem because LMI households are less likely to close deals, in part because they receive fewer quotes. Those are the two key findings. I'll start here with some background. So over 2 million households at this point have adopted rooftop solar in the United States. These households come from a variety of demographic and income backgrounds. This is one key point that's often overlooked. It's not just high income. There's plenty of low and moderate income households that have adopted, but it is true that income levels generally skew high among rooftop solar adopters. Another key fact to establish right out is that adoption inequity is not unique to solar. It's common in other industries, particularly for emerging technologies. But clean energy justice is an emerging item on the policy agenda, and there's a broad push to accelerate a transition towards more equitable adoption. So although adoption equity is not unique, it is possible to accelerate a transition towards more equitable solar adoption. Just to be able to picture this, in this plot, we look at the percent of rooftop solar adopters that earn less than or more than area median income. If solar were just randomly distributed with respect to income, we'd expect this to be about a 50-50 split. But we clearly see that those earning less than area median income are underrepresented by about 20 percentage points. So again, the skew is not complete. There are clearly a lot of low and moderate income adopters, but there is this obvious definite skew towards high income households. Another key piece of background is that solar adoption is becoming more equitable over time. This is something we would expect as the technology diffuses, costs come down, more LMI households are capable of adopting. We'd see this slight but still appreciable increase in the adoption among those earning less than area median income from 2010 to 2019. Again, most of these data are available on the website. These are all based on figures that we've published in the past. I encourage everyone to go check it out if you're curious about these background data. So what explains these solar adopter income patterns? First, let's think about at a high level. First and foremost, structural inequality, meaning income inequality and income segregation. The simple fact that there are many households that earn more or less than other households mean that some households are more capable financially of adopting solar than others, particularly at historically high rooftop solar costs. That becomes less of a factor as costs decline. A second high-level factor is technology diffusion. For most emerging technologies, there is this temporary phase of inequitable adoption, typically because costs tend to be high. You can think about this for personal computers, used to cost thousands of dollars and were well out of reach for many households. But over time, as costs come down, personal computers have become more ubiquitous across the income distribution. And then homing in more specifically on solar itself, previous research has talked a lot about demand side barriers. So low income households have cash constraints. They're less capable of putting together $20,000 or so to invest in a rooftop solar system. There's also important differences in home ownership. It is much more difficult to adopt and benefit from rooftop solar as a renter. And because low income households are predominantly or are more often renters than high income households, this results in a skew towards high income households. And a final is language barriers. This is established in the research that because solar installers tend to market to a certain demographic, this could be another demand side barrier. But the research to date hasn't really explored potential supply side barriers. So this is really the focus of this research. So we were curious about this hypothesis that maybe there could be income targeted marketing. That is, perhaps installers are focusing on certain customer segments based on income levels. Why might we think this? Well, one thing is that income targeted marketing is quite common in other industries. A reason for this is that businesses often tend to site in affluent areas, both because of access to customers, as well as access to specific type of employees. And then there's these three particular reasons why solar income targeted marketing may be common in solar specifically. Installers may hold three perceptions. One, installers may believe, rightly or wrongly, that LMI households equate to lower margins, lower profits. Installers may believe that LMI households are less likely to close deals once they have received a quote. And installers may perceive that LMI customers are more likely to cancel a contract once a contract has been signed. So given those reasons why installers may income target, how exactly would they do that? And the mechanism here is quite simple. Obviously, an installer does not know a household income, but because income is segregated, there are high income neighborhoods and low income neighborhoods. It is quite easy for an installer to deduce a household's income level based on where they live. And just a simple way to visualize this, here on the left, this is a chunk of Los Angeles County. On the left is median household income. On the right is PV adoption per household. We can see immediately this clear correlation between the high income areas on the left and areas of high PV penetration on the right. So it's not that installers necessarily target high income households as much as they're targeting high income areas. So now moving into the actual study, we looked at quote data from EnergySage. EnergySage is a quote platform connecting customers to a network of installers. And the nice thing about quote data is that we can get a deeper glimpse of what the installers are actually doing. Those who are familiar with our work know that we often work with installed system data, but when working with installed system data, we don't see the quotes or the customers that did not eventually adopt solar. So that's the benefit of working with quote data. We can see what installers are doing and to whom they're submitting quotes. A key aspect of the design, as I mentioned, installers don't know customers' income. The customer does not provide their income level when entering their data into EnergySage, but they do provide the address. So an installer can deduce a household's income level based on the address. So we use census tracts as a proxy for installers' perception about the customer's income level, and then study if installer quote behavior varies based on track income levels. This is the key figure that really summarizes the result in a descriptive way. So quote deviation, this is just the deviation from the average number of quotes. We do it this way because customers in different states receive different number of quotes. But just put simply, the bars above mean above average number of quotes, and the bars going down mean below average number of quotes. On the x-axis, these are different income bins. So right away, the most obvious relationship here is that those customers living in tracts where a median income is less than $50,000 per year are receiving far fewer quotes than those customers on the right living in tracts earning above $150,000 per year. Another way of visualizing this, customers can receive up to 7 quotes on the EnergySage platform. LMI tracts, in this case, we define as tracts where the median income is less than 80% of the state median income. Customers living in LMI tracts are far more likely to earn or to receive 1, 2, or 3 quotes, while customers in other tracts are far more likely to receive 5, 6, or 7 quotes. And of course, there's a regression because some of the descriptive trends can be misleading. We want to control for other factors to make sure that we're not looking at spurious correlations. In the paper itself, there's plenty more detail about the regression, all the controls. I'm just going to get at some really, really high level summaries of these findings. First is if we control for absolutely nothing, we see that customers in LMI tracts receive around 0.34 fewer quotes than customers on other tracts on average. In a way, this is the most important number from the perspective of an LMI household, because this is in fact the difference they receive. When we control for other factors, the difference falls to 0.27. In the paper, we discuss a bit about what these controls are, but the point is that installers are not necessarily income targeting. They may be avoiding LMI tracts for other reasons other than income. So when controlling for these factors, the difference falls slightly. Another interesting result is we find that this effect is mitigated if a customer lives in a tract that is otherwise surrounded by high income areas. The reason we think this is because if a customer is isolated in a low income area within a low income region, this effect tends to exacerbate. So we do find some evidence that if a customer lives in a low income neighborhood in an otherwise high income area, those customers do tend to receive more quotes. And then finally, one reason why customers may receive fewer quotes is because fewer installers are aware of those customers. When a customer requests a quote on the platform, that request is sent to a network of installers, but the network depends on where the quote originates. And it turns out that customers or in LMI tracts generate fewer installer notifications because there are fewer installers that are operating in those tracks. If we control for that, the difference falls to 0.2. So this basically demonstrates that most of the impact, most of this difference in marketing is from installers choosing to not submit quotes to customers in certain areas, not that customers are not being notified in the first place. So let's return to some of these hypotheses and look what the data can tell us. The first is business citing. So this is the hypothesis that maybe installers tend to locate in more affluent areas. To test this, we use data from the California Contractor State License Board. And indeed, we see that installers tend to locate in relatively affluent areas. 74% of installers in those data are located in zip codes above the median. So again, if this was even, we'd expect a 50-50 split. Here we see above median zip codes overrepresented, providing evidence that installers do indeed tend to favor relatively affluent areas for their headquarters. That doesn't necessarily mean that the income target, but being in a certain area likely skews that installers focus to relatively affluent areas. The second hypothesis is that installers may perceive that LMI households mean lower margins. This is supported to some extent in previous work, but in the data we looked at, the accepted prices did not vary significantly by income level in the quote data. So even if installers have this perception, it isn't necessarily true and it could be dispelled. The third perception is that maybe installers perceive that LMI customers are less likely to close. So here the idea is that once a quote has been submitted, a high income quote recipient is more likely to actually close a deal than an LMI customer. So here on the right, this figure, it takes a bit to unpack, so I'll stick with it for a bit. The dark blue are LMI customers of LMI tracks. The light blue is all other customers. And we do see first, there is this clear difference. Sorry, and the y-axis is the close rate. It's a relative close rate. For proprietary reasons, we're not able to share the actual close rate in the platform. But the important point is that up towards the top means more customers closing deals, and towards the bottom means fewer customers closing deals. So the first thing we see is that customers in LMI tracks are indeed less likely to close deals. This is true no matter the number of quotes received. But we also see this clear relationship between the number of quotes received and close rates. So over on the left, those customers that receive just a single quote are not very likely to close a deal, regardless of their income level. Over on the right, customers that are receiving 5, 6, or 7 quotes are far more likely to close deals, again, regardless of income level. So what this does is sets up a type of chicken and egg problem. Essentially, we're seeing that LMI households are in fact less likely to close deals, but they're less likely to close deals in part because they're receiving fewer quotes. So if LMI customers were to receive the same number of quotes as high-income customers, their close rates would presumably go up. And we have some hypotheses for why this may be. Previous work has shown that interactions with installers can increase confidence in the process. Households are more educated by talking to installers. So receiving more quotes essentially equates to a more informed customer who is better equipped to make a decision and then ultimately more likely to close. And then the final potential perception is that LMI households, installers may perceive that LMI households are more likely to cancel a signed contract. We don't test this directly in our study, but previous work does show that cancellation rates are higher in LMI areas. So this perception may be in part accurate. So now let's just close here with the implications of this work, thinking in the bigger picture about what this means. This is kind of a schematic suggesting that this is the way most work to date has thought about solar adoption and equity. Essentially, LMI households are less likely to pursue solar for a variety of demand-side barriers, again, cash constraints, home ownership, et cetera. We do see this as well in the quote data. So just looking at the customers that receive at least a single quote, there are fewer LMI customers than we'd expect. That is, LMI customers, LMI households are less likely to pursue quotes in the first place. So that's just one part of this picture. The second part of the picture is that installers are less likely to pursue LMI customers. This is based on the evidence of the study showing that LMI households are less likely or receive fewer quotes than high income customers. So this creates these two factors. And then the third is that LMI customers are less likely to close. So if you think about all three of these together, all three create a skew towards high income adoption. LMI households are less likely to pursue adoption in the first place. Installers are less likely to pursue LMI customers, and then LMI customers are less likely to close. And then we hypothesize that perhaps there's some interaction between these three levels. So LMI households are less likely to pursue adoption. That may be in part because installers are less likely to pursue LMI customers. A lot of previous work has shown that most households are prompted to pursue solar by something, some external prompt. So it is not the case that high income households are waking up and just simply deciding today is the day that I adopt solar. Oftentimes they think about it because an installer knocks on their door, or they see a billboard in their neighborhood, or they see solar installed on their neighbor's rooftop. Something is prompting high income households to adopt. And LMI households are just exposed to fewer prompts. If installers are not showing up and knocking on their doors, LMI households are indeed less likely to pursue solar because they're less likely to be pursued. So there could be this interaction. And then conversely, installers could be less likely to pursue LMI customers precisely because LMI households are less likely to pursue PV adoption. It creates this vicious cycle where both sides of the equation, supply and demand, are a bit skeptical of the other side. In the paper, we go into some of the potential policy implications of this. This is something that we really only discuss and infer, and we don't really test in this paper, so I'm not going to get into that here. So that's essentially where I want to end, is saying that the key picture that we paint in the work is that solar adoption inequity and these patterns are explained through this more holistic framework of both demand, supply side barriers, and future research can think about the ways that all of these interact. So up here is some contact info. I'll invite Sydney to come on and manage our Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And for all those listening, please keep on putting questions in the Q&A function. I'm also seeing a few questions come in on the chat, so I'll try to integrate those as well. But so the first question I think is fairly quick, and even I could probably answer it, but on slide 5, there's a question about the split between, whether 50-50 would be equal, if that's truly equivalent. And so I just wanted to point out that this was area median income. So because it's a median value, that 50% dotted line would be equitable, and such that, equal number in the broader population, both above and below. So that was a quick answer. I don't know, Eric, if you have anything on that, or if I could just pursue to the next question.
Well, just, it's true if you think about solar being concentrated in certain states. So the fact that it's concentrated in California, that's one reason it skews high, but correct, this is based on area median income. So It should be roughly 50-50.
Yeah, and that area median income is calculated at the metropolitan statistical area or county. So I should say at that level, it should be 50-50. So the next question is, did the study investigate the impact of availability of financing and or fees that the installing contractor would be required to pay to their financing partner to offer to LMI customers versus non-LMI customers?
No, but one of the extra variables in the paper is the financing preferences of customers. So when customers go on to the platform, they can say that I want to finance my system, and installers are less likely to submit quotes to those customers. And the reason this is important from the purposes of this paper is that LMI households are more likely to finance their systems. So it generates one additional reason why installers may be submitting fewer quotes to LMI households.
Right, and Eric has participated in a couple other papers that looks more closely at that financing, the financing interaction, I suppose, with adoption with low to moderate income customers. So the next question is, with the end of NEM 1.0, can we expect the equity gains to retreat for a while?
So I'll avoid the NEM question specifically and just come back to one of the points, maybe it's this one. We would expect, just based on diffusion patterns alone, that solar will become more equitable over time. We do look in other research in what could potentially accelerate this. We have talked about anything that makes solar less valuable to the customer, such as reforms in net metering, that's the NEM acronym, could make it more difficult for any customer to adopt, and will certainly make it more difficult for LMI customers to adopt. So that could slow this trend, but any technology does tend to diffuse over time into lower incomes. So yeah, we don't have the data or haven't done the work to make a more accurate projection.
Yeah, and this is also another space of exploration that the Electricity Market and Policy Group is starting to look at. So the next question, I'm going to combine Christina and Maynard's question. So supply side constraints could include willingness to quote, where it may be lower in some areas where there might be unsuitable roofs, where PPAs are unavailable, where there are just generally more renters or more multifamily units. Did you include this or account for this in the study?
Yes, so that's part of my point with the controls. I believe we had a control that was the percent of owner occupancy at the track level. And the reason earlier I said that the big difference or the key difference from an LMI customer is that they're receiving fewer quotes. That number falls after these controls, but it's in part because of these correlations between income levels and home ownership. So yes, we do control for that, and the difference is still there. And the vast majority of customers on the platform are single family homeowners. So it's still the installers are choosing to target certain customers that otherwise are in a similar situation.
Thanks for that. So the next question is the number of quotes driven by the level of customer interest? So would LMI customers get turned off by the first quote?
So the way the quote platform works is that a customer goes on, makes an account, puts their information on, and then installers see that customer and decide to submit. Typically, the customer should receive a handful of quotes from that initial expression of interest. For the most part, to my knowledge of the platform, the customer can pursue the installers that initially contacted them, but it's not a question of them going out and getting more quotes. So the number of quotes they received is sort of exogenous in the sense that It's based on that initial provision of information. One place this could make a difference is in the close rates. This is something that we have thought about, is that maybe, again, one reason that high income households are less likely to close, and the reason that customers receiving more quotes are likely to close, is because they're doing something differently. They're pursuing more installers, or they're following up on more leads. But that shouldn't really affect the high level finding here.
So this is related to a similar question. So it was, could it be that LMI customers need fewer quotes to determine that they may not be able to afford solar, whereas higher income might be looking for the best deal? So I think that your answer covers that, in the sense that it's not like quotes are coming in one at a time and the customer's making individual decisions on each one, but that they all kind of come in somewhat simultaneously.
Yeah, so they should come in a batch. More could trickle in. So there could be something to that. And another thing is that there is some price variation, obviously, across quotes. But if people who are familiar with quote platforms are far more competitive than kind of the off-platform solar business. So prices are much lower on quote platforms and off the platform. So it's unlikely, it is possible that a low-income customer could go onto EnergySage and just say, okay, well, it's in this range. But that wouldn't really, they wouldn't gather much more information by getting more quotes. So that is a possibility.
Yeah, it's a good point. So I'm sort of trying to manage the chat and the Q&A at the same time. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A as opposed to the chat. But I did see something in the chat which I just lost. Oh, does size come into play here? So soft costs might increase the price per watt of small system sizes. So does that come into play with some of this work?
So yes, in the sense of this broader work, and it is true that LMI households are generally pursuing smaller systems because they have smaller rooftops. So I don't know that that's germane to what we're talking about in this study, thinking about the differences number of quotes submitted, but it is certainly a factor that you can get through economies of scale, a much better deal installing rooftop solar on a much larger rooftop.
Great. So this is a combination of multiple questions. So 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to generalize this question to be, so this presents the problem fairly well, but what are potential solutions? So it looks like here there are things like structural barriers, just because, as you mentioned, they're not necessarily targeting households, but areas. And so some things like where people live, it's more of a structural thing. But there's also this perception issue, which you mentioned. And one thing I'm pulling out of the chat is, so creditworthiness. I actually want to quickly point out one thing. So creditworthiness and tax credit eligibility are reasons why they don't close. So that is likely true, but also having worked with some data where you had income and creditworthiness, they're not correlated. I think in a total separate analysis, but it was like 10%. So so that is a perception issue. And now adding on to some things in the chat, could public incentives be offered at the city or state or national level to encourage doing business in these residential areas? So that, I guess, is one potential sort of solution. Could you comment on that and also elaborate on other potential issues to deal with these structural and perception problems that you lay out?
Yeah, so this idea of bringing installers into specific areas is something that we've been talking about for a while now, not only based on this research, but certainly reinforced by this paper. So the idea here is there are low-income incentives out in various states, But based on the research we do in this research, it does appear that those incentives would be more effective if they could somehow induce installers into low-income areas. So not just looking for a handful of low-income customers, otherwise high-income areas, really getting installers into neighborhoods that have been historically underserved. We don't really, as researchers, we're not policymakers. We can only come up with so much. In the paper, we do toss out a few ideas. One is building on policy around food deserts. There were subsidies to bring certain types of markets into low-income neighborhoods. So this is about the business citing point that I made earlier. There could be ways to subsidize or otherwise encourage installers just to put their headquarters or their offices in lower income areas. That would at the very least shift the focus of installers, make them more aware of where they work, build relationships. So that could be one idea. Another idea would be to base incentives on quotes rather than installed systems. The reason this could potentially work is because the data here show, we've done previous work showing that getting more quotes is beneficial. Customers who receive more quotes tend to get lower prices and are more likely to close, as we show here. So perhaps there could be a way to break through these perceptions that installers have and incentivize them to get quotes to low-income customers to get over that risk. So let's just benefit the doubt. Cancellation being a good example. LMI households appear to be more likely to cancel contracts. That's a legitimate risk from the perspective of business. There could be a way to incentivize more installers to take that risk, offsetting perhaps the occasional loss from a cancellation by designing an incentive based on the number of quotes submitted rather than the number of installed systems.
Great. And another potential, so another question that is related to this is, did homeowners who signed final contracts get referral bonuses for each LMI neighbor who eventually signed? So this also could go towards a potential solution and carrot essentially to provide more quotes to this community. I'm not sure if you have any more comments or if I should just move on to the next.
No, yeah, referrals are consistently referred to as the most effective way of customer acquisition. So yes, if there's a way to motivate referrals to be designed in a way that enhances LMI adoption, that could be effective.
Great. So the next question is, this is another, okay. So this is another potential solution. There are economic discounting and big decisions. So this goes towards more of an educational and awareness solution. So it's about advertisement campaigns and sort of putting out narratives about solar retrofitting and financial benefits, good media coverage around the metropolitan region. What could increase about talking positively about solar desirability? So I guess this goes towards some of the social factors that come into play here in terms of demand for this product. So I might generalize this question further and say, and going back to the slide of the different, so you have supply side, demand side, the 4-quadrant slide that you have here. So generalizing that question, how do these interact, I guess? How do you determine the relative importance of one versus the other and how you tackle this?
I don't know. I determine the relative importance. That's obviously, we're doing a lot of work moving forward, and some of it will be attempting to answer that question, really thinking about the context of solar adoption inequity. So coming back to that, the question, I mean, it sounded like it was about exposing low-income customers to more solar advertising, solar marketing, solar education, etc. And so clearly that's intertwined here. I mean, part of the reason why solar installers may not be investing in marketing in certain areas is because of structural inequality. There's this perception that, well, it's not really, there's no payback to do marketing in that neighborhood. Putting a billboard up in this area doesn't make any sense. It won't be profitable. So clearly all these different levels interact. And again, if there's a way to acknowledge that as a real perception, say there is perhaps a risk to making certain decisions, and that could be a role for policy, is to split that risk with installers.
Great, thanks. So another question that you sort of got at a little bit, but were things more balanced back when leased solar was a major part of the market?
Well, that it comes back to this. No, and clearly things are becoming more balanced over time. So this plot here is not cumulative. This is each year. So every year, the new cohort of installers is more equitable. You know, maybe you could look at this and say there's a dip, and that could have been due to some lessees leaving the market. And I guess just for context for other listeners, around from 2010 to roughly 2014, leasing and power purchase agreements were really dominating the market. And then there was this clear shift towards ownership, some combination of ownership and loans. We did some work last year showing that LMI households are far more likely to prefer leasing. So the fact that some installers walked away from that market could pose a challenge to LMI adoption. So there is something to that. I would certainly hypothesize, all else equal, that could slow down transition to more equitable solar. But that's basically it. It's going to slow down a trend that is going to occur.
Great. And so I'm at this point jumping around a little bit back to some topics that you've already somewhat covered. So this actually goes just one step back. So do LMI residents think that information access is a limitation? And the parenthetical is, I find it hard to identify comparisons of effective solar to electricity conversion rates from different solar manufacturers. I'm not sure how the two comments relate, but I guess the first question is, do LMI residents think that information access is a limitation?
I don't know that about LMI customers specifically. Sydney, you might, but in general, for any customer, that is true. I think that the point of the comment is that even for solar experts, it can be really, really hard to know where to find trustworthy information. I've studied, in theory, I've studied data sets of millions of systems, but when I actually look at a real quote, it is quite confusing. So I don't know if that's a specific barrier to LMI customers. Someone might have done research on that.
Yeah, and this also actually gets at another comment. So if I lived in an LMI neighborhood, would I maybe not want to get 3 good bids rather than one? Would I not also want to get 3 good bids rather than one difficult to evaluate, though possibly good bid? So I guess this is a question about how these bids come in, how understandable they are as well. So you just got at sort of like, it's hard to get good information and sort of discern what's out there. So what is sort of like the understanding of these bids as they come in, and does that impact the closing rate, for example?
Yeah, so again, because we use data from a quote platform, it's a bit unique, and we talk about that in the paper. But one of the missions of EnergySage, I'm not their words, but as I perceive it, is to simplify the whole process for customers. So installers are only allowed to, in the initial submission, provide so much information to the customer. I believe it's something like a proposed price, system size, some technologies. But the idea is to avoid inundating customers with all of this extraneous information that just makes the process more difficult. So at least in the quote platform, if you get 3 quotes, you're comparing reasonably standardized information. So what we really believe is not necessarily that you get more info, it's that you get more prices. So if you see, okay, all these prices are within 5% of each other, that makes the whole process more trustworthy. So the quote platform is a pretty unique environment. But I think coming back to the question, all else equal, LMI or otherwise, you want to get more quotes. You want to be able to compare across installers, get the best deal according to your own preferences.
Great. So I'm again combining a few questions. We're getting a lot of good questions, so keep them coming. I'm just trying to navigate them all. So my general question will be, how could this research be expanded, or any next steps? And then to integrate some of the questions in the Q&A. So one is sort of thinking about the aspect of green jobs. So if solar panels were, say, made in America or contributed towards sort of the green jobs, so employees in green jobs, would people in LMI neighborhoods be friendlier to solar? So that's one question. I'm sort of listing them all out, but you should see them in the Q&A, Eric. The next is, how large a monthly cost savings did homeowners need to see studied across the average of income of all neighborhoods in order to be willing to agree to purchase solar? So I guess how did presented cost savings affect close rate, essentially? And then they phrase this question as, is there a savings threshold associated strongly with a willingness to solarize? And the next, again, everyone can follow along in the Q&A. Can we study saturation rates in the neighborhood? And doesn't one's neighbor's adoption of solar contribute to each other residents' willingness to begin considering solar? And yes, so those 3 questions are essentially potential next avenues. So are there any ones of those you want to comment on? And then more generally, how could this research be expanded?
Yeah, so we'll start with expanding the research. Yeah, this is great that people are asking lots of good questions, and hopefully you're interested in the work, because we're doing a lot more of it. And so in kind of 2 areas, one is we want to just further understand the context around solar adoption patterns and how these 4 areas interact. So that's one area. And then at the end, I sort of propose that these different levels interact with each other. So understanding these dynamics better. We'll be doing work coming up in the area of social influence. So that was kind of something that brought up in one of these questions. All right, and then, so green jobs, I don't know specifically in terms of rooftop solar, but we do, so a couple things we do know is that large national scale installers do tend to install a bit more on LMI households. So these are companies that are not necessarily local in terms of where they're based, but oftentimes they're working with local partners. Rooftop solar installation is sort of inherently solar. And then outside of the context of rooftop, there is data showing that in LMI areas, or just anywhere in general, that communities are more likely to accept large-scale solar if that is somehow led by a local company or is generating local jobs. So that is clearly something to, there's clearly something to this idea of creating local green jobs. All right, and then the threshold, we didn't look at that in this study. I would be amazed if someone else has not. So there must be some research out there showing some sort of savings threshold. And this is another idea with diffusion, is that early on, 10, 20 years ago, the savings threshold was negative. There were people that were adopting solar long before it could make them any money. as the technology expands, we're getting into people that have much higher and higher thresholds. So that's part of this idea of diffusion. Costs come down. We're beginning to get to more customers who really need a quicker and quicker payback. All right, and then the third one is saturation. All right, yes. So this is about saturation and peer effects, basically. Doesn't one's neighbor's adoption of solar contribute to each other residents willing to begin considering solar? Yes, absolutely. There is tons of work on this showing that solar is effectively contagious. It's something that we have thought a lot about. And I mentioned earlier that if you are in a relatively affluent area, nowadays, you're almost guaranteed to see a solar panel somewhere. And if you live in that area, it's going to make you think, well, maybe I should check out solar. Maybe I could afford this. But if you're in a low income area and none of your neighbors have solar, you've never seen solar panels anywhere, you don't see the trucks going with the solar installation marketing on the sides. The idea of adopting solar probably seems like a distant, unfeasible prospect. So we have thought about this, thinking about maybe there's some way to seed adoption in low-income areas. Perhaps that could be through a supply-side model, such as working with a specific installer to focus on low-income areas. So not the question is a definitive yes, there is a big effective influence, and that's something we'll be studying.
Thanks. Yeah, so we have just a time check, 7 minutes left. So I'm going to give you, we're going to try to get through all these, but there are a lot of good questions. So we do a bit more combination. So now I'm going to ask you a series of sort of stakeholder specific questions or sometimes areas of future research. So from my perspective as a state worker who helps implement our solar program, what, if any, are the incentives or other programmatic fixes to address that? So I'm assuming this question is sort of like just for state specific workers. So from a state government point of view, what are some solutions potentially?
Solutions to
alleviating, so where did the question just go? Sorry.
Maybe accelerating LMI adoption, maybe.
Yeah, and it also preceding it was text about how installers are going to obviously favor those who they think are going to close or who are going to go with their bid. So I guess on a state level, how would the state essentially create solutions to this problem?
Yeah. So I guess starting with one thing that you just said there, it is really important to recognize that installers are going to do what installers do. They're profit maximizing companies. There's no problem per se with what installers are doing. We shouldn't ask anything of the installation industry that any other industry would not be doing. So the point of the question is, if you really do want to induce change, it really is going to have to be through policy or some type of nudge. We have done previous work showing a few approaches that work. The most obvious would be incentives for LMI households. So incentives for income qualifying households. These can certainly motivate LMI adoption. And because of this idea of social influence, the data would suggest that if you design LMI incentives to be distributed in low-income areas, such as one of California's programs, that could create this seeding effect. So you can get solar into specific neighborhoods, begin generating peer effects, begin generating this contagion. Probably not a good analogy anymore, but begin the process of social influence to get more solar in those areas. And then earlier on, I mentioned some ideas based on this paper that you can potentially provide subsidies to installers to site headquarters in specific areas or submit more quotes to LMI customers. And then a final one would be, there aren't that many states anymore that don't allow third-party ownership. but promoting or somehow supporting access to financing would clearly benefit LMI adoption.
Great. So at this point, we have 4 minutes left, so I'm trying to get as much in here as possible. So on a very local level, there are some comments about what city government employees could potentially do. There are also some comments and questions about what local corporate entities could do, or things like community centers, and then also retailers that specialize in income targeted marketing, like Dollar Tree or Dollar Generals and thrift stores. So on a very localized level, so we went from state to more city or even more specific. What could cities, local governments or corporations do to also aim to address this problem?
Well, at least two things come to mind. One is that cities or local jurisdictions are more aware of key stakeholders. Again, this is based on previous work that shows that this effect of social influence is much stronger when it comes from a trustworthy source. So obviously a state government doesn't really know who the trustworthy source is at some community, but a city jurisdiction could. So perhaps that means a community center or a church or something along those lines, supporting something like a community solar project on a church rooftop, which is oftentimes a great space for solar, could begin generating this idea of, look, there's solar in this neighborhood. Perhaps solar could be for me. And the point about working with Dollar Tree and those types of companies, that's really interesting. There was a lot of solar marketed through Home Depot, and I imagine a few other retailers, but it would be interesting to think about ways to use that model in stores and retailers that cater to more of an LMI market. That's an interesting concept.
So I'm going to preemptively apologize for not getting to everybody's questions, but Eric, if you could go to the last slide to show the email addresses, please feel free to reach out. So the last question I'll ask is just how this kind of research can actually make an impact. So the question is, how can academic research on this topic begin to inform practices and decision-making in the solar companies? And there's a follow-up question, but I will leave it at that.
All right, so in the solar companies, and that's the focus of this question, we talked about other governments. One thing that research could potentially do is to begin to look at these perceptions. So I mentioned on profit margins, we didn't find any evidence to support the notion that LMI customers equate to lower margins. So we could follow that up with more work to really dispel that perception. In terms of close rates, it'd be really helpful to better understand why are LMI households less likely to close. If we knew the specific list of reasons, that research could get out into installers and could help installers help LMI customers navigate the process. And same thing with cancellation rates. So research could hopefully show what is the specific issue constraining LMI adoption and how could installers help LMI customers over the finish line. And we're at the top of the hour. That was an awesome discussion. You have all of our contacts here. Definitely encourage you to reach out to us and look out for our future work.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you, Eric, for giving us a great presentation. And thank you all for the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them, but yeah, that was really fantastic. And like Eric said, feel free to reach out.